Thank you very much, Becky. And thanks to all of you. It's really a pleasure, honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about the historic orchards of Pacific Northwest National Parks. Just going to talk about 3 orchards specifically. But I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the history of orchards in the United States to get some context for these 3 orchards that we'll subsequently talk about. And I'm Susan Dolan. I'm the Bureau Historical Landscape Architect of the National Park Service. I'm also a horticulturist by training. I've worked for Park Service for 23 years, and I've been in my current role for 10 years, which is part of the Washington, D.C. National Office. I'm the National Manager of the Cultural Landscapes Program for the National Park Service. And I'm going to be talking about 3 orchards, one in San Juan Island National Historical Park, one at North Cascades in Stehekin, and one at Fort Vancouver. And before we look at those specifically, let's do a little bit of background on the history of orchards. And some of this will be very familiar to many of you, and I apologize if it's a repeat of what you already know. So first of all, why is the National Park Service interested in maintaining orchards? Well, we do this to fulfill the National Park Service mission. The mission of the National Park Service is to preserve and protect cultural and natural resources for the enjoyment of present and future generations. And historic orchards and fruit trees are cultural resources. And take a look at the painting on the right side there. That is a very early seedling orchard in America. And we can see that these are seedling trees by their sort of unruly habit and their extremely large size and the fact that they aren't planted in neat rows. All of those things are clues to the fact that this is a seedling orchard. And we're going to come across these again, so you might want to keep that one in mind. So orchards are considered historic when they're eligible for the National Register, for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. And it might seem peculiar, but we use the National Register as our litmus test for what is preservation worthy, for what is historic and preservation worthy when it comes to historic preservation. There are a number of property types that are listed on the National Register, and those are buildings, structures, objects, sites, and districts, and orchards within cultural landscapes that I work with are listed on the National Register as sites and districts. And a site is often something that's sort of smaller and more discrete. A sort of singular concentration of stuff is a site. At the top, we're looking at the Adams National Historical Park in Quincy, Mass. And the orchard is within a very small site. We would consider this to be a site, so it'd be listed on the National Register as a site. But something that's much larger and more spread out, is more complex, is a district. But really, there's kind of a sliding scale between a site and a district. But at North Cascades National Park, the Buckner Orchard is part of a larger district, and we're going to look at that later. So orchards can be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. They are very often within cultural landscapes in national parks, and 2/3 of all national parks have historic parks, I should say, I'm sorry, they're set aside for their history, and the majority of national parks have cultural landscapes within them. And so when is an orchard or any historic property eligible for listing on the National Register? What do you have to have in order to be worthy of listing on the National Register? You need 2 things, and one is historic significance, and another one is historic integrity. So an orchard within a cultural landscape as a site or district has significance when it has importance in American history, and that importance can be on the national level, the state level, or the local level. Not everything that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places is nationally significant. It can also be significant on the local level, and the patterns of local history and still be eligible for the National Register. So it has significance, and it also has integrity, which is the measure of authenticity it can be eligible for listing on the National Register. So authenticity is kind of the hallmark of the extent to which a place looks the same today as it did during a period of significance. It's the measure of how authentic and still recognizable this place is since the period of significance. So there's a little bit of background on historic properties and orchards as historic properties and the National Park Service mission to preserve historic properties as a kind of cultural resource. Let's also just review some orchard terms for a minute. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with all of this. I don't mean to be condescending, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, we're going to look at species, variety, rootstock, scion, tree form, and tree spacing. Over on the right here, you're looking at an aerial photograph of an orchard within Jack London State Historic Park in California in the Sonoma Valley. And this orchard doesn't have anything to do with the history of Jack London State Historic Park. It belonged to a state hospital that originated as a poor farm that was self-sustaining. So the patients, the people that lived in the hospital, had to take care of the land and raise their own food. And this orchard that dates back to the late 19th century was laid out in very distinct species blocks. We've got a block of apple, we've got a block of prunes, we've got a block of apricots, a block of cherries, plums, etc. And it still retains those patterns today. And that's one way in which this landscape retains integrity. It remains authentic. Looking at species as being sort of a subset of genus, and we're really just recapping that species are things like apricots, peaches, and cherries. These are all different species from each other. And examples of more species of fruit, a species is the difference between a pear and an apple, a plum and an almond and an olive. These are all different species. And of course, we're looking at the USDA watercolor collection from the late 19th century right now. But when it comes to varieties, the varieties is of course a subset of species. And here we're looking at examples of varieties of apple. Spitzenberg, Gravenstein are different varieties of apple. And if we look at pears, of course, Basque, Seckel, and Vicar of Wakefield are examples of different varieties of pear. And when I teach people about the history of orchards that work for the National Park Service, I want to make sure that they understand that when you're correctly labeling a variety, we're writing its name out. The variety name goes inside single quotation marks like this. So really the proper way to write out the name of a Spitzenberg apple would be Malus domestica Isocus Spitzenberg, like this. Oh, I beg your pardon. Already. So now let's look at the concepts of rootstock and scion, and probably everybody in this meeting is really familiar with these concepts. We've got the scion, the upper part of the fruit tree. We've got the rootstock, the lower part of the fruit tree, and we've got a graft union that joins the two of them. So the scion is the variety part. It's grafted to a rootstock of a different individual to propagate the variety, in order to reproduce the variety. The variety is something that is created by humans. It's not naturally occurring, and we can't get that variety to breed true from seed through sexual reproduction. The only way we can continue to multiply that variety is by vegetative propagation. And we take a cutting from the top of the tree and we graft it to roots. And we do this because many orchard fruits do not like to form their own roots from cuttings. They're not happy doing that. They're much more happy to have a cutting meld and fuse its tissue with the root system of another individual and to form its own roots. So we take the scion, the variety part, and we graft it to a rootstock. And the rootstock is from a different individual, and it just is there to provide the roots for the variety part. But today, most fruit tree varieties are grafted, but things didn't historically start off that way. That's why it's important to make the point. We can see a graft union very often. You can see one in this young tree here on top, and we can see a graft union in this old pear tree at Manzanar National Historic Site in California. But we can't always see a graft union. In very old trees, sometimes the graft union is beneath the level of the soil. There was a belief in the 19th century that it was important to plant grafted trees low so that the graft union was beneath the soil to encourage the scion to root. That's something that we don't do anymore. So we use grafting, of course, to unite that scion with the rootstock. There are many different types of grafting. Bud grafting, root grafting are examples, but they're all about taking two plants and joining them together for the reason of perpetuating a variety. So we have just looked at trees that are grafted, and in America, fruit orchards had trees that were grafted mostly from the 1800s onwards. And in the first couple of hundred years of colonial settlement in America, trees were started from seed. They were introduced into this country, the orchard fruits by seed, and they were grown from seed. So that means the trees were all one tree, not two individuals joined together. The tree was on its own roots, and therefore it wasn't a variety, it was a seedling tree. So even when the tree grows up big and tall, we still refer to it as a seedling tree as opposed to a variety tree when it's starting on its own roots. So an apple and other orchard fruits will tolerate germinating from seed and generating a shoot and some young roots and rooting themselves in the ground and growing up into a tree. But they won't necessarily tolerate having a cutting taken and then starting the roots from that cutting. They'd much rather be grafted than to form their own roots. So let's take a look at that first period in the history of orchards in America. In the first couple of hundred years of settlement in this country, people brought fruits from their old countries by seed, and orchards proliferated throughout the early colonies and also in the western United States, in the Spanish lands of Alta California, particularly in the mission grounds. So when these orchards were started from seed, they often were irregular in their layout. They weren't geometric. Often the trees emerged where the seeds sprouted and they were encouraged to grow up, and they didn't necessarily have any kind of a geometric layout at all. The trees were wild and woolly, often with thorns and spurs and crooked habits, and they had tall trunks because the lower trunks were browsed off, the limbs were browsed off by browsing animals. And very often the fruits weren't particularly good to eat raw, but the fruits were harvested for cooking, drying, making into fermented beverages, and also to feed livestock. So they weren't necessarily used to be eaten raw. So we've got full-size trees in this time. These are seedling trees on their own roots. They're not varieties, and very often they had irregular spacing. And we have a couple of trees in the National Park System that date back to this period that are fruit trees. At Minuteman National Historical Park in Massachusetts, it's a park that's set aside to commemorate the start of the Revolutionary War. We have apple trees that are seedlings that date back more than 250 years. And something that's really important, an important point, is that when a tree is on its own roots, when it's a seedling tree, it tends to have much greater longevity. We're going to talk later about how grafted trees have different amounts of longevity, but seedling trees on their own roots have the greatest longevity out of the fruit orchard trees. National Recreation Area. So another example of fruit trees that date from this first period in orchard history in America are at Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area in New Jersey, where we have a historic farm and fruit trees, apple trees that are more than 250 years old. So once again, those are seedling trees on their own roots. They're not grafted. Another example from this period is the old apple tree at Fort Vancouver. Even though it actually was started from a seed in the 1820s, it's really reflective of this very first period in the history of orchards in America. It's reflective of the 1600 to 1800 period because it's a seedling tree. And at that time, the Pacific Northwest was very undeveloped and they were sort of doing things the sort of old-fashioned way, I think we can say at that time. And I'm going to come back to the old apple tree at Fort Vancouver in a minute, but I want you to know that it is really represents this the earliest times of fruit growing, orchard fruit growing in America. So by the time we move into the 19th century, things really start to change. Catalysts for change are things like fruit societies, horticultural organizations, gentlemen growers that have an influence on horticultural shows and the breeding of varieties. Those couple of hundred years of seedling trees in America gave rise to just a huge amount of varieties originated in this country. And so the 19th century is the golden age of pomology. It's when most varieties were grown in the United States in orchards. So we're now using, of course, grafted trees in order that we are growing varieties. We still have full-size trees because these trees are grown on seedling rootstocks. But we're starting to have geometric spacing. We're pulling the horse and cart through the orchard, up and down the rows. We want to have an efficient layout to get equipment in and out. And so we're using geometric spacing. Gone are the days of the irregular spacing of orchards. And we have many, many varieties. So this is an example of the tree form in the 19th century. It's a variety tree on a seedling rootstock. It still has an enormously tall trunk, and that's because still the wildlife, the livestock were in the orchard. They were browsing off those lower limbs, clearing it off, lifting up the canopy. You can see here in this photograph, we've got an 1890s photograph of a Baldwin apple tree that was planted in the early 1800s, and look at the colossal scale of that tree and the massive size of the trunk. So in the national park system, we have a few orchards that date to this period of orchard history. The parts of the Adams National Historical Park orchard date to this time, and that's the home of President John Adams and President John Quincy Adams in Quincy, Massachusetts. But also in the Yosemite Valley, we have the Curry Orchard. We have several orchards, including this one, the Curry Orchard, which dates to 1859. And it's an orchard that's so typical of the 19th century. The trees are massive, the trunks are tall, and every tree is a different variety from the next. We have about 100 trees in this orchard, and every one of them is a different variety. Also, from this period of time is the Crook Orchard at San Juan Island National Historical Park, and we're going to talk about that one in a minute. Each of these pear trees is a different variety from another, and they were planted right about the end of this period of time, this sort of golden age. By the time we get to the 1880s, through the Second World War, we're really into a different type of orchard. Orchards change dramatically. And a catalyst for it was the creation of the US Department of Agriculture in the 1870s. And they brought research and science into the production of orchard fruits, created textbooks and circulated bulletins, educational materials that turned farmers into growers and orchardists. Something that's very dramatic that happens during this time is the shape of the tree, the form of the tree changes a lot. We no longer have those enormous tall trunks that we had in the 19th century and in the first era either. We have what we call low-headed trees. We have very wide spacing, 30 feet on center, the trees, and we have fewer varieties. So interesting that by the time the 20th century rolls around, there's a great rationalization in the types of varieties that are grown. We're really starting to understand that varieties have different amounts of commercial characteristics, and those varieties that have the most favorable commercial characteristics are chosen for planting, and those that don't aren't planted anymore. So those ones that have good keeping qualities, they're durable, they ship well, they store well. These become desirable commercial qualities, and the varieties that have those qualities are selected and used, and others fall by the wayside. So even by the turn of the 20th century, we're seeing a great reduction in the number of varieties that are offered in commercial orchards and are grown in new orchards. So the tree form changes a great deal from the 1880s to the Second World War. And this is a 1918 photograph of a tree that was planted in 1900. It's in a textbook. And we're seeing it has an extremely low head to that trunk. It's Arkansas black orchard. And then something else that we can see here too is this is a whole Arkansas black orchard. By this time, we start to see whole blocks of varieties grown, whole orchards just growing one variety rather than each tree being a different variety from the next. And of course, the idea behind this low heading is to try and pull that canopy closer to the ground. These are still full-size trees on seedling rootstocks, but by low heading the whip when it's young, cutting it off at a height 18 inches to 3 feet from the ground and allowing those scaffold limbs to grow out on that whip, we're shortening the trunk and trying to pull that canopy closer to the ground to make it easier to interact with the tree. And by this time, we'll also start to see pruning styles. It's really only in this third period that we're seeing the open bowl, the central leader, the modified central leader appearing. So we have an example of this period in orchards in the National Park System. And one example is the Buckler Orchard in North Cascades National Park. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. But it's an epitome of the style of orchards that existed in this third period from the 1880s until the Second World War. But after the Second World War, we move into the period that we're in now, which is a period of movement towards greater density of planting, high density systems, much tighter spacing, much smaller trees. We also start to see an uptick in the number of varieties grown again. It's almost like we bottomed out in the 1980s, and in more recent years, there's been more demand for choice and more varieties are being grown again. So we start to see the adoption of clonal dwarfing rootstocks, and these rootstocks for apple were originated in England. They became adopted in the United States after the Second World War. They really moved east to west across the country, and we go from standard to semi-standard to semi-dwarf to dwarf. It took for technology to sort of be invented, and before true dwarfs were we could use, they were favorable, they were realistic. We needed to develop smaller equipment to make use of smaller trees in order to grow them at higher density in order to get the same yield on the same piece of land. So the progression is slightly smaller to very small. Here we're seeing semi-standard trees at Capitol Reef National Park in Utah. And after the 1970s, we see the adoption of smaller and smaller dwarfing rootstocks. And dwarfing rootstocks are developed for most species, orchid species by this time. Here we're looking at semi-dwarfs in eastern Washington, and of course the most dwarfs, something like an M9 rootstock for apples that need to be trellised like this. And another example of trellising. And this is really, I think, an important point of contrast from the orchards of the former periods of history. We're looking at a Cosmic Crisp orchard in eastern Washington with a 5-foot spacing, approximately 500 trees per acre. And contrast that with the Buckner orchard in North Cascades from the 1920s, where we have trees at 30 feet spacing and only 40 trees per acre. So clearly these are different orchard systems, different orchard landscapes. Orchards have evolved tremendously over the last several hundred years. And the orchards that are in the national parks that are preserved are sort of vignettes of earlier times of archaic horticulture. They give us an understanding of how people used to live at these different times in history that aren't the same as how, of course, we live and use land today. So just as sort of a recap, in the earliest periods, we have seedling trees, they're ungrafted. Generally, orchards had no geometry. There was irregular spacing. By the second period, the 1800s, most of the 1800s, we see an abundance of varieties grown. We've got grafted trees, of course. They're grafted to seedling rootstocks, and they now have regular geometry in the orchards. There's just a realization that having these sort of rows and columns of trees makes it easier to get in and out with your horse and your cart and do what you need to do. And the old apple tree from Fort Vancouver is evocative of this first period. And the crook orchard that we're going to look at San Juan Island is evocative of this second period. And then by the time we get into the third period, we're after the creation of the USDA in the 1870s. And then we move into the low-headed trees that have a pruning style. By this time, of course, we're keeping the animals out of the orchard. We're not letting that livestock browse on those lower limbs anymore. Those trees have short trunks, they're low-headed. We've got seedling rootstock still. We're, of course, using all variety trees. And these orchards have a regular geometry. And we really see the widest spacing in history in the United States during this time. It's like we now fully understand just how large these trees can get, how big the canopies are, and we want to try and give them all plenty of space by the time we're in this third period. So we see this really wide spacing in that time. And in the fourth period, the last period where we are now, we've moved towards high density orchards, many trees, clonal dwarfing rootstocks, but the clonal dwarfing rootstock has the influence of foreshortening the lifespan of the tree. So the orchards on the clonal dwarfing rootstocks aren't an investment for 100 years, like an orchard was in the 19th century. There's an expectation that the orchard will be around for 10, 20 years and be ripped out and replaced with something new. So we talked a little bit about seedling trees having the greatest longevity on their own roots. Then trees that are varieties that are grafted to seedling rootstocks have a somewhat less longevity, but still have great capacity to live a long time. It's those dwarfing rootstocks that have less longevity. So that the restraint that the dwarfing rootstock imposes upon the tree has an effect on the longevity of the tree. It sort of foreshortens the life cycle. It makes the tree fruit sooner in its life than it would on a seedling rootstock, but it seems to sort of bring the whole lifespan forward. So we also have the Buckner orchard. That's an example of this third period, and we're going to take a look at that in a minute. Speaking of longevity, longevity is affected by species. You know, we have a blue whale living longer than a fruit fly. Now, we know that in nature, different species have different longevities. And of course, it's the same in the orchard fruit world. Natural longevity is affected by species as well as affected by type of rootstock. So if all of these species are growing on their own roots, they can top out the capacity for longevity. And if they're on seedling rootstocks, they'll have somewhat less longevity, but a similar pattern. It's when they're on dwarfing rootstocks, they will have considerably less longevity. So we go all the way from peach, having really the least longevity of all these species, through apple and pear, can reach 150, 200 years, particularly on seedling rootstocks or on their own roots, all the way up to olive and fig, which are the grandmasters of longevity on planet Earth and can live thousands of years. And this is partly because their secret is that they renew themselves from the base. The olive and the fig, they send up basal sprouts. They can renew themselves over and over, reinventing themselves over time. So each tree can have sort of great longevity and vitality, regenerating from the base. Everything I've talked about in terms of the history of orchards and the different periods is described in this book, Fruitful Legacy. I know a number of you, I recognize a number of you on the meeting here, you already have it. If you don't have a copy and you'd like one, you can email me, or you can go to this URL and download your own PDF copy of it. In fact, I should be able to put into the chat a link to it, but I can come back and do that later, Becky. So go ahead and email me if you'd like a copy, or download your own copy from this URL. And my email address is susan_Dolan@nps.gov. Susan_Dolan@nationalparkservice.nps.gov. Alrighty. Now let's look at those three orchards and how they are representative of their time in orchard history. We're going to look at the Crook Orchard in San Juan Island National Historical Park that dates from the 1880s. We're going to look at the Reconstruction Orchard at Fort Vancouver that represents the 1820s to the 1840s. And we're going to look at the Buckner Orchard at North Cascades that dates from the 1920s. So let's start with the earliest first. Let's start with the Reconstruction Orchard at Fort Vancouver. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, isn't she talking about historic orchards? And therefore, why would she be talking about a reconstruction? Well, this has got a twist to the story, so bear with me. So Fort Vancouver National Historic Site, right beside the Columbia River, near Portland, Oregon, way south in Washington State, was the site of a Hudson's Bay Company fur trading post from the 1820s to 1846. This is the time when the lands north of the Columbia River belonged to Great Britain. They were part of British North America. South of the Columbia was the United States. North of the Columbia River was British North America. And the Hudson Bay Company was a sovereign company of the Crown of England. They represented royal interests in America, in this continent, I should say. And they operated a fur trading post here on behalf of the British Crown. And with that fur trading post, they also had agricultural lands, had massive agricultural operations, including orchards, to provide food for all of their workers, and also to raise foods that they could use to trade with indigenous people for various goods, including furs. And of course, they were interested in beaver pelts and sea otter pelts. So we have a reconstruction orchard at Fort Vancouver. The fort itself, the stockade of the fort, is a reconstruction. And when this park was set aside in the 20th century, it was enacted with a mandate to reconstruct the fort from nothing. So this park is all about reconstructing the Hudson Bay Company period of time. And that's partly because it was very significant in the history of the Pacific Northwest and the United States. This is the time before the international boundaries were established that exist today. This is the place that sheep were first introduced into Pacific Northwest. Fort Vancouver is the place where wheat was first introduced into the Pacific Northwest, and also orchard fruits. Many firsts happened here. It was a sort of first essence of colonial settlement in Pacific Northwest. And of course had a devastating impact on Indigenous people. So Fort Vancouver, we know, had tremendous amounts of agricultural lands. In this 19th century engraving of the fort, we can see the stockade and we can see an orchard here. But it wasn't until 2004 that the National Park Service got around to actually trying to accurately depict an orchard at Fort Vancouver and reconstructing the type of orchard that would have been here in the 1820s until the 1840s. And we did this with support of park volunteers and also the US Department of Agriculture, the National Colonial Germplasm Repository in Corvallis, Oregon. They were tremendous help to us in propagating the trees. So in 2004, we planted out about 100 trees. These were almost all of them seedling trees because we're trying to depict that earliest time in history when the trees are started from seed. And we laid them out at pretty wide spacing, and these trees are going to grow up wild and woolly and thorny and crooked, just like forest trees, like the apple trees of the forests of Kazakhstan. But notice this first row of trees in this aerial shot of the Fort Vancouver reconstruction orchard. These are distinct from the others. In this first row closest to the stockade, we planted clones of the old apple tree that I'll get to in a minute. So these were cuttings taken from the canopy of the old apple tree, grafted onto seedling rootstocks. So clones of the old apple tree grafted onto seedling rootstocks. That's the whole first row here. But all the other trees are seedlings on their own roots. And the provenance of these seedling trees are from Old English cider apples. And the National Colonial Germplasm Repository in Corvallis were able to give us seeds and propagate these trees from seed from this cider, heirloom cider lineage for us. So I want to now talk just a little bit about the old apple tree. The old apple tree is across a freeway, a state route, and across a railroad track, severed for the last 100 years or so from Fort Vancouver proper and where the stockade is and today the reconstruction orchard is. The old apple tree is on City of Vancouver property, and the City of Vancouver cooperatively manages this tree with the National Park Service, and also they have received a lot of donated services from local arborists to take care of this tree. The tree dates back to the 1820s, it's a seedling. It was grown from seed. And at that time, near the Columbia River, there was a huge village of people that were indentured servants to the officers of the Hudson Bay Company inside the stockade. And there were people from all over America, different indigenous people, even from the Hawaiian Islands that lived here. French Canadians, people of like more than 30 different languages lived here. And one person planted this fruit tree probably outside their hut, their cabin, their humble house, and it grew up and provided them fruit and shade. So what we did in 2004, we planted trees that were cuttings grafted to seedling rootstocks from the old apple tree. And since then, the reconstruction orchard has grown up, and because these are naturally extremely vigorous trees on seedling trees, they've become huge. And these are filling in nicely. And we have a bicycle path right by them. So visitors are walking by, they're cycling by, park staff and volunteers are taking care of the trees. And they have their own wild and woolly character that's typical of this early period of orchard history in America. But meanwhile, in June of 2020, at the age of approximately 200 years, the old apple tree died. We had a period of very hot weather down there in Vancouver, and we also had some high winds combined with hot weather. And then just suddenly one day, somebody noticed, oh my goodness, the old apple tree is completely crispy. The leaves are dead. And then suddenly we were worried. Had it died? Did it really die? Well, if we look closely, we can see that the tree has a number of root suckers, and the city of Vancouver was very careful to anticipate the demise of the old apple tree and started to protect these root sucker trees with tree shelters. And starting to sort of protect them and allow them to establish themselves, anticipating that they might one day soon need to replace the old apple tree. And because the old apple tree is a seedling, it's one tree, and these root suckers are coming from that one whole tree, they are the same genotype, a clone of the old apple tree. And just a couple of weeks ago, we took those root sucker trees, we separated them from the mother tree, which is now standing dead and has had the trunk reduced in height to not be a hazard. We took those root sucker trees and we planted them out into gaps in the reconstruction orchard where we had lost some trees. Some trees had failed, we had some gaps, and so we put the old apple tree clones in there. So we've got clones on seedling rootstocks of the old apple tree, and then we've got 100% whole clones of the old apple tree. And this tree just has the most amazing vigor in its genes, and we expect these trees to do extremely well in this orchard. But we did leave one strong root sucker tree beside the old apple tree to continue its legacy. So eventually that sucker will replace the old apple tree and will probably remove the last vestiges at some point of the old apple tree. But it will be the old apple tree still. It will still be one and the same tree. Let's move on to the Crook Orchard at San Juan Island National Historical Park. This is an English camp. So San Juan Island National Historical Park has two units on San Juan Island. It has English camp on the north and American camp on the south. And the Crook Orchard is here, which is in English camp. It's right here on the edge of Garrison Bay. And why do we have San Juan Island National Historical Park? This park is here because it was the site of a standoff between England and the United States from 1859 until 1872. A standoff, a dispute about where the international boundary should be between the United States and British North America that would later become Canada. So we've got an encampment of the British Royal Marines who are here to represent the interests of England during this international boundary dispute. And right after the time that those British Royal Marines were done and took off back to England, immediately a Scottish settler came in and planted some trees right on the parade ground. And that's why we have the Crook Orchard. So the issue of the international boundary I find quite fascinating. In 1846, when the Hudson Bay Company was booted out of Fort Vancouver because of the Treaty of Oregon, the international boundary between the US and British North America was established as the 49th parallel. And here's the 49th parallel, but you can see how the Treaty of Oregon in 1846 wasn't very precise about where that international boundary would go through the San Juan Islands. And hence the tensions that arose and then kicking off the big war in 1859 with American settlers shooting a pig of a Hudson Bay Company employees. So a British pig getting shot by an American. And for between 1859 and 1872, the American army occupied the south end of the island, the British the north end of the island, and they waited until the dispute was decided of where that boundary would go, whether it would go to the west of the San Juan Islands or to the east of the San Juan Islands. And ultimately, Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany helped to arbitrate that the boundary would go in the Haro Strait rather than the Rosario Strait. And by doing so, San Juan Island became part of the United States. And then right after that, and this is really what this land, this area of English camp looked like at the point when the British Royal Marines left in 1872. And then we have the crooks coming in right after, and these right over here is where these trees are. And I actually just want to point out, if you're there at English camp today, you can see the formal garden that the British Royal Marines created to make this place lovely during those years that they lived here. You've got this blockhouse and other historic structures. You've got a parade ground. And before we're into the parade ground, we have the Crook Orchard. So this is because a gentleman by the name of William Crook, a settler from Scotland, he homesteaded here and started planting fruit trees. And he would have gotten started in the 1880s. He actually moved in here in 1876. You can still see that blockhouse in the background. He planted a bunch of trees, probably not just pears, probably other ones besides. And he also had sheep that he grazed under them. So he was really using that sort of golden age method still. Big trees, tall trunks, livestock under the trees. And he planted sort of one of every different variety. This is what the trees look like today. And we had the germplasm repository do DNA testing for us. And we learned the varieties, and we've got some interesting ones, including the Pound variety and the Vermont Beauty variety of pear. The Pound is particularly curious. The Pound pear is an enormous pear. It weighs a pound, and it really doesn't really ripen. It doesn't ripen on the tree. It stays and it hangs on the tree all winter long. It's almost like having a grocery store all winter long on the tree. And these pears are excellent for baking. So the Pound pear, the enormous pears were used primarily for cooking. But we've also got this very sweet and lovely Vermont Beauty pear, which is about the size of a sickle. It's very early, it's very buttery and very fragrant and delicious. So we have those and the Bartlett, as well as the Bosque, the Vermont Beauty and the Pound pears there. So the Park Service has been taking care of these trees and pruning them, and we've had some help from the Western Washington Fruit Research Foundation and the Western Cascade Fruit Society in taking cuttings from all these different pears and grafting them, and actually Rain Tree Nursery helped us graft them. And what we did is we used them to rehabilitate an orchard, a historic orchard nearby to the Crook Orchard. The park didn't want to rehabilitate and grow this orchard down on English Camp Parade Ground any more than it already is. We are preserving these trees over time, but we're not going to sort of reconstruct an orchard on the parade ground, because the park was set aside to really commemorate the history of that international boundary dispute and the Pig War period, 1859 to 1872. So we have the Crook Orchard here, but adjacent, just across the road, a little higher up, we have the Sandwich Orchard. And the Sandwich Orchard has some old trees in it, but it had much bigger spaces that we could fill in with replacement trees. And Sam Benowitz helped to, of the rain tree nursery, helped to propagate these trees from clones that we took from the Crook orchard, and we planted out pears. We also propagated an apricot that was here, an apple, and plums as well. And so today we have a young orchard establishing around the historic trees in the Sandwith orchard. And Sandwith was a contemporary of Crook. Isaac Sandwith homesteaded here about the same time that Crook homesteaded down on the parade ground. So they knew each other and they had some of the same varieties. So it was really appropriate to take the varieties from one place and use them to help fill in the gaps in another place. Now let's look at the Buckner orchard. And this is in North Cascades National Park at the very top of Lake Chelan. And this is one of the remotest places in the lower 48 states. You need to take a ferry or a float plane to get here. There's no road that will take you to the top of Lake Chelan and Stehekin, where the Buckner orchard is located. Something that I find very special about the park brochure is that it actually does call out the Buckner orchard on it. It's quite unusual that we actually have an orchard called out on a park brochure map, but this is a visitor destination and people come here to see the Buckner orchard. It's a very, very special place. It's at the top of this glacially carved valley, and it's in a horseshoe bend off the Stehekin River, this incredibly picturesque place. It's listed on the National Register as part of the Buckner Homestead Historic District, so a bigger district, but the orchard is one of the most important parts of this historic district. And here I'm up, I think I'm up McAllister Mountain looking down on the orchard. You can see the Stehekin River and see the orchard here. There's also a cluster of historic buildings here, and this road system is also historic, as is the irrigation system. So this is significant as an early commercial apple orchard in Washington, and it's also significant as an early homestead in the Stehekin Valley. This orchard dates back to 1917. It has about 200 trees on 4 acres. And these trees are planted at 30 by 30 spacing, very wide spacing. And the orchardist is Laurie Thompson, and actually she's peeping out here from behind this tree. Laurie Thompson, my friend and colleague, has been taking care of the Buckner orchard for more than 20 years. And she is a champion. She has people helping her. She has volunteers as well. But she is the engine of passion that really is behind the preservation of the Buckner orchard today. All of the trees are low-headed. They all have their short trunks, and they also have an open bowl form. So in that regard, they absolutely typify their period in history when the Buckner family settled here in the early 20th century, and they laid out an orchard to grow fruit commercially. They used the latest thinking in their shaping of the trees and in the spacing of the trees, and that's this low-headed open bowl form. Once again, we're in this third period where we start to see this sort of great paring down in the number of varieties grown. And so the Buckners didn't grow one of each different varieties. They just grew a few varieties, the ones that they considered to be commercially viable, ones that they could ship down the lake to Chelan and Wenatchee and markets there. So they grew the earliest iteration of Red Delicious, called Common Delicious, synonymous with Hawkeye. We have that variety here, as well as Rome Beauty, which was already establishing itself as an important variety for Eastern Washington, Lodi, and also Jonathan. Very few varieties were grown in this orchard. It was a decision to just grow those varieties they thought would be commercially viable at that time. And something that's very, very special, we've got this orchardist who spends 6 months of the year in the orchard, and she is propagating the old trees on seedling rootstocks and shaping them with low heads, open ball shapes to fill in where trees are dying. So we preserve something that's living by replacing in kind as it dies. But she also tries to prop up the old trees for as long as possible. You know, for the National Park Service, historic preservation means to try and perpetuate, hold on to what's original, what's historic, for as long as possible. And she uses this really wonderful old-fashioned technique of bridge grafting and in-arch grafting to repair cavities in these trees in order to try and sustain their longevity for as long as possible. So these trees have cavities. Sometimes they have missing bark because the elk are rubbing on them. The bears are climbing in the trees and ripping limbs. It generates cavities. And she uses this technique of bridge grafting, taking scion wood from the canopies and bridging, grafting across the cavities to restore the flow of xylem and phloem, almost like conductive bypass surgery, vascular bypass surgery. And here you're seeing, here's a close-up of this cavity where Laurie has bridge grafted scion wood across the cavity to restore the conductivity from the roots to the shoots back to the roots. And she's also done some in-arch grafting, and this is from root suckers that she's using just to give structural support to this tree. And here she got really creative and she did a whole bunch of bridge grafts across this massive cavity. You can see here, even if the bridge grafts are happening at a diagonal, as long as there's a general vertical orientation to them, they will eventually graft, form a union, and restore the connection between the roots and the shoots. And as they grow, they swell and they start to encapsulate this entire cavity. It's a remarkable thing. Laurie was taught this by orchardists in the Wenatchee area. It's a really old-fashioned technique, and she's had tremendous success extending the lives of the old trees by using bridge grafting. But I want to leave you really with this thought that the National Park Service is as interested in the trees and the landscapes that they're in as the varieties. Heirloom varieties are important. We're trying to preserve rare varieties. We're trying to preserve heirloom varieties. But even more important is to preserve the whole place that these trees are living in. And here at the Buckner Orchard, the orchard is part of a cultural landscape that consists of a road system, an irrigation ditch system, a building cluster, a pasture where the horses were pastured historically and they generated manure that went on the trees here. The whole system is a landscape that the Park Service is trying to preserve. So here you can see the ditch system. You can see the historic Buckner cabin. You can see the fruit trees in the distance here. And there's also a bunch of different buildings and historic equipment that's all protected as part of the cultural landscape. So in the National Park Service, our mission is to preserve cultural resources, including cultural landscapes. And we do this by extending the lives of what's historic for as long as possible, but also planning for future replacement in kind, and also sometimes putting things back that have gone away, that have vanished. And we do this using historical research, documentary evidence, etc. But we're in the in perpetuity game. We're here to attempt to preserve orchards in perpetuity as part of American history, as part of the cultural landscapes that they exist within. So that's really all I have for you for the presentation, but I want to encourage you to contact me, Susan_Dolan at nps.gov. If you'd like a copy of that Fruitful Legacy book as a PDF file, write me, or if you have other questions about what I've shared today. So I'm ready for your questions whenever you're ready.